I'm Terry, and I am reading Chapter 8 from Dr. Mark Agresti's book, Tales from the Couch. Chapter 8 is I Know It's a Waste of Time. Melvin is a 57-year-old man, tall, slender, with very pale skin, glasses, and long brown hair. He's dressed in a blue Oxford shirt, khaki pants, and topsiders. He lives with his parents, who recently moved here to South Florida from New Jersey. His father is very bright, a retired engineer, and his mother is a housewife. He has two brothers. One works on Wall Street with great success, while the other does well for himself, running a growing contracting company in Massachusetts. Everyone in the family is extremely intelligent. Melvin works for a large technology company, finding and extracting bugs from software code. Monetarily, he excels at his job, making over $400,000 a year. From the outside looking in, there are no reasons why Melvin needs to live with his mother and father. He chooses to live with them for reasons which will become self-evident. We're going to go through this one day in Melvin's life. Once you know, one day you really know his entire life. Melvin wakes up every day at exactly 4:30 a.m. He spends exactly 20 minutes in the shower. He puts on the same blue Oxford shirt, same khaki pants, and the same topsiders. He drinks out of the same coffee mug and eats the same bowl of Cheerios cereal with milk every day. He doesn't have to be at work until 9 o'clock in the morning, but he has to get up at 4:30 a.m. to complete his morning rituals. The rituals begin by checking every lock in the house, and then checking the microwave, the freezer, the refrigerator, every outlet, every plugged-in appliance, and then checking every light to make sure it's off. Then he repeats that 2 or 4 times, sometimes 6 times, and the number of times of checks must be evenly divisible by 2. That's his number. The reason he checks and double checks these things is due to his compulsion. His obsession is that something catastrophic will happen. If he doesn't check, his anxiety will increase exponentially. Once he manages to get out the front door, he then has the process of getting into his car. He has to check the car thoroughly, look under the hood, and check the tires. Then he has to check to make sure the car is in just the right place in the garage. It must be equal distance from the side of each garage wall. When he backs out, he has to back out at exactly the right angle so that the car remains equal distance from the garage walls. If it's wrong, he has to pull back into the garage very carefully and try once again. This process could take another 20 or 30 minutes just to get out of the garage. Once he manages to correctly exit the garage, and he is underway to work. If he goes over a bump, he's in fear that he may have run over someone, that he might have killed someone, even though logically he knows he didn't run anyone over. He has to circle around and go over the same bump. Sometimes that could be 2 or 4 or 6 times, but always a multiple of 2. But each time he turns around in South Florida traffic, it takes 15 minutes. So that's an hour to an hour and a half of time lost. Melvin knows that these obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors are illogical. They make no sense, but he just can't stop them. Melvin is an intellectual, a capable, intelligent, kind, thoughtful, and very complex individual. So after getting dressed in his usual outfit and taking over an hour at home shutting off all of the appliances, checking the doors, the lights, and the outlets, then spending an hour and a half to get to his place of work, which is actually just 15 minutes away, he finally gets to work. He must be parked in the space just so. It must be directly in the middle of the space with equal distance between the car and the lines of the parking spot. Symmetrically is critical. Besides symmetry, remember that he is consumed with the number 2. So everything must be in the multiple of that number. That includes the number of steps it takes to get to the front door of his work. He counts the steps, and that number must be evenly divisible by 2. If he is waiting to cross the street and a car goes by, he has to wait until a second car goes by before he can cross the street. He is constantly consumed by the number 2. It must be exhausting. Despite the trouble it causes him, if Melvin doesn't perform these rituals, the anxiety would be intolerable. Intellectually, he is not impaired in any way. He knows his rituals are a waste of time. He is disturbed by them, and they cause him depression as well. He's like a prisoner of his own mind. So he came to me, and we got to work right away. I started by trying to get him out of his own head and addressing people around him. He established a rule that if he sees someone, he has to greet them. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. In his mind, it's a very complex decision to greet strangers, but he values politeness. I told him that it is polite to say hello, but he values it is polite to say good morning, but then he wondered if he should ask the person how they were, or if that would be rude. Just to encounter a single person consumes a lot of mental energy. For instance, Melvin will see someone he recognizes, and there will be a hello and how are you doing. After this encounter, he'll spend the next 10 minutes thinking, was I too invasive? Was I too friendly? Was I not friendly enough? Was I too casual? Should I have said something different? Imagine second-guessing every human interaction you have, day in and day out. That would be a constant mind bender. When he gets to his office building, he doesn't take the elevator. He wouldn't want to risk small talk, so instead he takes the stairs, 2 at a time, of course. He gets to his office and he begins to process and correct code. He is very intelligent and he's probably better than anyone in his department at correcting code, but this is a double-edged sword. He works relentlessly, but has an issue with letting projects go. Melvin won't turn projects in until they're perfect. This is a form of procrastination, a waste of time, and a waste of energy. Once he gets to 95% or 98% without errors, his boss wants him to turn it in because that's an acceptable error rate. That may be acceptable to the company, but not for Melvin. It has to be perfect, 100% error-free. This procrastination hurts his career because he's unable to turn in his reports on time. Now lunchtime comes. The time is a problem because he leaves the office to go to the cafeteria downstairs. All the way down the stairs, 2 at a time, all he can think about is if he turned off his lights or if he left his computer on. So he has to go back up the stairs 2 at a time to check his office lights and computer. Satisfied for the moment, he goes back down the stairs 2 at a time to the cafeteria. But there is always an itching in the back of his brain. Was he sure all the lights were out? He couldn't eat until he knew for sure. So what does he do? He runs back upstairs 2 at a time to his office. The lights were off, the computer was off, and all was well in his world for a moment. But he didn't want to risk going back down the stairs to the cafeteria because he was sure his coworkers would notice and wonder what on earth he was doing going up and down the stairs over and over. Many times he didn't even get lunch because he was so busy with checking and rechecking his office. After the lunch period is over, he goes back to working through his code, making sure there are no mistakes, because his code must be perfect. He works long hours and procrastinates when it comes to turning in his projects. He doesn't want his employer to know that he is working so much, so he clocks out with everyone else at 5 p.m., but he stays in the office until 9 or 10 p.m. He procrastinates for perfection. There can be no code errors. Eventually, he decides that he's going to leave work for the day. So now it's back to the rituals. He walks out to the car, counting steps in twos. Once he gets to his car, he does his routine checks, opening the hood and checking the tires. He has the same rituals on the way home as he does on his way to work. If there's a bump, he's got to circle back at least twice or more, other multiple of twos, to make sure that he didn't hit anyone. Sometimes he even ends up going back to his office to make sure he turned off his lights and computer. When he gets close to home, he calls ahead to a specific Chinese restaurant and gets a certain dish in a white box that costs exactly $2.92. It's a rice dish. Basically, all he eats is rice. After checking and rechecking that his windows are closed and his front and back doors are locked, he eventually goes to bed. And when he wakes up the next morning, he starts his rituals all over again. Sometimes on the weekend, he'll get stuck. Weekends throw him off his routine. He'll literally get stuck for over 2 hours looking at a picture on the wall, and as he's looking at the picture, he's fiddling with it, tormenting himself, trying to make sure it is exactly level. He feels like he can't make it right, and his mind gets trapped in his feedback loop, that he is powerless to stop. He knows it's wrong, he knows it's a waste of time, but he's trapped by this. Sometimes the number 2 is especially problematic. If Melvin sees a single tree, a single leaf falling, or a single bug, he cannot figure out how to calculate that experience within the framework of the number 2. This will freeze him in place, desperately seeking a multiple of 2. Melvin has another obsession, one that is potentially far more dangerous than that of the number 2. This obsession causes him the greatest distress. He has the obsession to punch his mother, even kill her. On some level, he knows he will never do this, but the thought that he's going to punch his mother and kill her torments him, makes him depressed, makes him very sad and guilt-ridden. He knows it's wrong, but the thought is always there, unbidden. Melvin has made efforts to date, but he can only hide his rituals, his compulsions, and his mental math for so long. Eventually, it always interferes with the date. It's really difficult to carry on a conversation when you're so consumed with all these thoughts. They take over his mind, intrude upon his thinking, and essentially trap him. The obsessions, the compulsions, are draining. It exhausts him, it decreases his productivity, and it destroys his self-esteem. He thinks everyone thinks he's odd because he's so consumed with his bizarre thoughts. When he comes to my office, I've got to literally talk him off the edge. He may be stuck with the thought, I'm going to punch my mother and kill her. I have to tell him, Melvin, that's not reality. You know it's not reality. You're not going to do that. He replies, it's nice to hear you say that. You have faith that I won't do it, but I can't get the thought out of my mind. It's there day in and day out, 24/7. I try to explain to him, it's just a thought. There's something going on with your neurochemistry. There's a malfunction with your feedback loop. It's not working, he says. I know. I just need to hear you tell me that. I'm not going to punch my mother. I oblige and say, you're not going to punch your mother or hurt her in any way. That's not you. Your intellect knows that that's not real. It was well after office hours. I'd already sent the secretaries home and continued the session with Melvin. Eventually, we ended the session. I told Melvin, I'll walk to the car with you. I then went through the office, shutting off all the lights, turning off the computers, and locking the interior doors. Melvin and I stepped outside the door, and I closed and locked it. All in all, it took me maybe 45 seconds. Melvin was incredulous, he said. That would have taken me 2 hours. I said, Melvin, you have my sympathies, you have my compassion. I understand your pain. My office is on the 2nd floor, so Melvin took the stairs 2 at a time, but the problem was the number of steps. They were an odd number, which didn't lend them to being divisible by 2, so he kept having to go back up to the top of the stairs to try again. Eventually, after multiple trips up and down the stairs, I told Melvin that the number of steps wasn't going to change. They weren't going to conform to the number 2. I could see his anxiety building, but I was having a hard time talking him down. I have a doorman in my building, and he sat there, incredulous, watching this unfold. Keep in mind, Melvin is not in any way psychotically impaired. He is in touch with reality, so he is aware he's being watched, and he's mortified by it, but he simply can't help it. He's completely humiliated that people see this, and he goes to great lengths to at least attempt to hide it, but that's a difficult thing to do. After quite some time, watching him climb up and down the stairs, I finally said, Melvin, I'm going to go to the car. And as I was driving out, he was still trying to get to his car. I had no idea how long it was going to take him, but I knew that if I was there trying to walk with him, that I'd just be causing more stress and anxiety because he would feel like he was holding me up. In terms of treating Melvin's obsessive compulsive disorder, I explained to him that it is very difficult illness to treat. I told him, you seem to be suffering over symmetry. Your mind wants symmetry. That's the obsession. You have intrusive thoughts about symmetry. Your compulsion is the activity, which is to make sure that everything around you is symmetrical. You also have a calculation obsession. The obsession is the intrusion of the number 2. Compulsion there is to do mental mathematics or exhibit behaviors that work out in multiples of 2. You also have something called a catastrophic compulsion. That's where you'll think of doing something catastrophic like punching your mother or killing her or running someone over in your car. That is the obsession. The compulsion is to check and recheck to make sure you didn't run anyone over. You also have the obsession of hypermorality. If you see someone, you just say hello. The hypermorality dictates that you must have the compulsion to establish in your mind that you did not break any moral code or do anything morally wrong. There also is the checking, rechecking, doing, undoing, and that may tie in with catastrophic fears. The obsession is that if you leave something on, there will be a fire or there will be something catastrophic because you left something on or left something unattended. There are also these ritualistic behaviors of sameness, wearing the same clothes, same belt, same shoes, and same hairstyle, taking the same length, shower using the same soap, eating the same breakfast, and drinking from the same coffee mug. Same everything every day. A key feature here is that something that might take one person 10 minutes would take Melvin 2 hours. He knows that this is not right, and it causes a huge amount of guilt and anxiety. This is someone with a PhD in computer science who's walking up and down steps over and over again, taking different staircases and elevators for lunch at work to make sure that no one knows that he has to go back to check the lights and computer in his office. One thing Melvin does know for certain is that everyone thinks he is bizarre. He comes across as very odd, and he feels like people think he's crazy. But in reality, he's not. There are treatments for this kind of problem. What works for Melvin is crisis intervention counseling. We do this gradual desensitization where I expose him to something he's uncomfortable with, like not checking his phone to see if it's on or off, for example. Then we deal with the anxiety that creates. The idea is that you gradually try and desensitize someone through the process of having them think about something first and then have them not act on it. We also do cognitive behavior therapy where I appeal to his intellect. I tell him that his thoughts are not real and that they're lying to him, and I validate his intellect and his capabilities. I tell him that the rituals he does are unnecessary, that he doesn't need to do them. But if he does do them, it doesn't mean he's a bad person. Logically, he understands that the rituals are not necessary, that he doesn't have to carry out his obsession and compulsions. We spend a lot of time focusing on that. But we end up having emergency sessions about every 2 weeks where he gets into this negative feedback loop about the number 2 in his head. He may have a bad interaction with someone at the grocery store or someone getting gas, or he'll think someone is looking at him funny. The simplest things can set off his obsessions, and they can last for hours, days, months, or even years. During that time, he is consumed by obsessive compulsive thoughts to the point where it is almost impossible to get anything done. For example, Melvin went into crisis when he found out that he needed to have a colonoscopy. He wasn't sure if he should get it done, where he should get it done, if he should use his insurance or pay for it himself, and which doctor he should go to. He was very distraught over all of this. He didn't know the ethical, proper way to handle it. These thoughts consumed him for months. Melvin lives with his parents, but because he gets up so early and gets home so late and works so much, he rarely ever sees them. He has no friends and he's completely isolated. He has a neighbor who has accepted his condition. She is a retired school teacher, and now they are starting to go out to lunch. He helps her go to her dental and doctor appointments. She tolerates his obsessions and compulsions, but the relationship has gotten very intense to the point where she started to make sure activities were divisible by 2. She does these things so Melvin doesn't experience any undue anxiety, but now she has to go through carrying out his obsessions and compulsions just to be with him. Otherwise, his anxieties will get out of control. This reminds me of a story. I was doing hospital consults, and this 13-year-old girl who had obsessive compulsive disorder was in a terrible accident and was paralyzed from the neck down. So her mother had to feed her. But in order to feed her, the mother had to go through all these rituals and certain behaviors with the food, touching the food in a certain way, turning the food in a certain way, cutting the food into a certain number of pieces, feeding her the food in certain sizes and certain orders at certain times. But she had to perform rituals with her hands, clapping and crossing them over her chest before picking up the fork to feed her. This was all so her paralyzed obsessive compulsive daughter wouldn't experience any undue anxiety. Obsessive compulsive disorder is very powerful and it's extremely disturbing, and people with it become very isolated, very stressed. One interesting thing I have found is that I rarely see them drink alcohol or use drugs. It seems that's not part of the illness. The illness is having the obsessions and the compulsions and carrying through with them, but they don't seem to self-medicate. For example, in Melbourne, I tried him on high doses of many drugs because this particular illness requires high doses of drugs to treat it. I tried full courses of the medications, fluoxetine, fluvoxamine, paroxetine, clominopramarin, quetiapine, tramadol, mirtazapine, and olanzapine. I tried augmenting these different drugs with ondansetron for years. Melvin has been my patient for about 25 years. He was reluctant to try any addictive drugs, but with nowhere else to turn, we finally used a benzodiazepine. What finally worked for his anxiety was clonazepam, 1 milligram twice a day. It had a calming effect on him, and his obsessions and compulsions lessened. In psychiatry, obsessive compulsive disorder is one of the most difficult illnesses to treat. About the best you can hope for is maybe a 60% reduction in obsessions and compulsions. In most patients, it's more realistic to expect a 20% to 30% reduction. I still see Melvin every 3 months, but more often when he's stuck in his head. I work hard on breaking the cycle. When he's stuck in an obsession, I do my best to unstick him, and we work through the obsession. There are different variants of obsessive compulsive disorder, but a common theme is the torment it causes the affected individual. Another component is their repetitive nature. Everything is the same, ritualistic, repetitious. Caretakers and people who are living with these individuals need to realize that they may not be interacting appropriately because they're so consumed with these intrusive thoughts and these behaviors that they have to act on. If they don't act out these behaviors, they become so anxious, so agitated, although never aggressive. I find they're usually the very sweetest, kindest, and most gentle people in my whole practice. All the repetitive rituals they go through, they just can't help it, even though they know it's a waste of time.